When the news stopped being safe, a documentary horror narrative section warns. The headline. The first article appeared in the Meridian County Register on March 14, 2019, buried on page 7 between a notice about road construction and an advertisement for a local furniture store's spring clearance sale. It was the kind of story that newspapers printed to fill space. The kind that existed not because it mattered, but because column inches needed to be occupied, and local papers still believed in the ritual of comprehensive coverage, even when comprehensive meant documenting events so minor that no one would remember them by the following morning. Local man reported missing after failing to arrive at work. The article was 63 words long. It described a man named David Herrera, 41, a maintenance supervisor at Meridian County Hospital, who had not shown up for his scheduled shift on March 12th and had not been seen since. His car was found in the hospital parking lot. His apartment showed no signs of disturbance. Police were asking anyone with information to contact the department's non-emergency line. That was all. 63 words describing the disappearance of a human being wedged between infrastructure updates and discount sofas, printed on newsprint that would be recycled within a week and forgotten within a day. Eleanor Vance read the article 3 years after it was published, sitting in the basement archives of the Chicago Tribune, where she worked as a research analyst, a job title that meant she spent her days surrounded by dead newspapers, searching for patterns that reporters had missed, connections that editors had overlooked, stories that had been printed and then abandoned without anyone noticing what they actually meant. She had pulled the Meridian County Register as part of a larger project, a piece about healthcare worker burnout and unexplained absences that had been pitched as a human interest story, but that her editor hoped might generate enough engagement to justify the research budget. The David Herrera article was supposed to be one data point among hundreds, a statistic, a name that would appear in a sidebar if it appeared at all. But Eleanor read the 63 words twice, then 3 times, then a 4th time, with a growing sense that something was wrong with them. Not factually wrong, not grammatically wrong, but wrong in a way that she couldn't immediately articulate. Wrong in the way that a photograph is wrong when something in the background doesn't belong, but you can't identify what. She set the article aside and continued her research. She found 12 more cases of healthcare workers who had disappeared without explanation in the 3 years she was examining, a number that was statistically unremarkable, that could be explained by coincidence and probability, and the simple fact that hospitals employed millions of people, and some of those people would inevitably vanish for reasons that had nothing to do with patterns. But 4 of those disappearances had something in common with David Herrera. 4 of them had occurred on the 12th of a month, March 12th, July 12th, November 12th, February 12th, and 4 of them had been reported in articles that were exactly 63 words long. Eleanor counted the words in each article multiple times, certain she had made an error, certain that the consistency was impossible, because word counts in newspapers were determined by available space and editorial preference, and the specific details of each case, not by some hidden template that would produce identical lengths across different papers in different cities covering different people. But the counts were accurate. 63 words each, 4 articles, 4 dates ending in 12, 4 people who had never been found. She told herself it was coincidence. She told herself that she was seeing patterns, because seeing patterns was her job, and people who looked for connections eventually found connections, whether the connections existed or not. She told herself that the feeling in her chest, the tight, cold sensation that had begun when she noticed the dates and intensified when she counted the words, was imagination rather than intuition, the product of too many hours in a basement surrounded by stories about people who had suffered. She almost believed herself. Then she found the 5th article. The 5th article was from the Portland Mercury, dated October 12, 2020, 18 months after David Herrera's disappearance, in a different state, in a different context, describing a different person. Nurse fails to return from scheduled break. The article described a woman named Sarah Chen, 34, a registered nurse at Portland General Hospital, who had left her unit for a 15-minute break on October 11th and had not been seen since. Her personal belongings were found in the break room. Her car was in the parking garage. Police were asking anyone with information to contact the department's non-emergency line. Eleanor counted the words, 63. She read the article again, searching for any detail that didn't match the pattern she was beginning to see. Any element that would break the template and allow her to dismiss what she was observing as coincidence. The structure was identical. The phrasing was nearly identical. Even the final sentence. Police were asking anyone with information to contact the department's non-emergency line was word for word the same. She searched for more articles. She found 7 more over the next 3 hours, spanning 6 years and 9 states, all describing healthcare workers who had disappeared from their workplaces without explanation, all published on dates ending in 12, all exactly 63 words long, all ending with the same sentence about contacting the department's non-emergency line. 12 articles total, 12 people, 12 dates, all unremarkable, all forgotten, all identical in ways that should have been impossible. Eleanor sat in the basement of the Chicago Tribune, surrounded by dead newspapers, and felt, for the first time, the specific horror of recognizing a pattern that no one else had seen. The horror of understanding that something was happening, had been happening for years, and that the evidence had been published in plain sight without anyone noticing because the evidence was too mundane to attract attention. She began taking notes. She began building a file. She began doing the work that would eventually destroy everything she thought she understood about reality. And somewhere, in a system she didn't know existed, her attention was recorded. Section 2. The detail. The detail that should have been questioned appeared in the 6th article Eleanor found, a brief from the Sacramento Bee dated April 12, 2018, describing the disappearance of a hospital administrator named Michael Torres. The article followed the template exactly, 63 words, healthcare worker, date ending in 12, standard closing about contacting authorities. But this article included one additional element that the others had not. A quote. Mr. Torres had expressed no intention of leaving, the article read. His colleagues described him as present until he wasn't. Present until he wasn't. Eleanor read the phrase multiple times, trying to understand why it disturbed her so deeply, why those 4 words felt wrong in a way that the rest of the article did not. It was a strange way to describe someone's disappearance. Normally, quotes from colleagues would say things like, "He seemed fine," or "There were no signs of trouble," or "We're all very worried." The standard language of bewilderment that people used when someone they knew vanished without explanation. Present until he wasn't was different. It described the disappearance not as a mystery, but as a transition, not as something that had happened to Michael Torres, but as something Michael Torres had become, as if he had been present, and then he simply wasn't. And the transition between those 2 states required no explanation, because the transition was the explanation. Eleanor searched for the colleague who had provided the quote. The article didn't name them. She searched for follow-up coverage of Michael Torres's disappearance. There was none. She contacted the Sacramento Bee and asked if they had records of who had been interviewed for the article. The records didn't exist. Not lost. Not sealed. The records had never existed. The newspaper's archive showed the article as written by staff reporter, a placeholder attribution used when a piece was too minor to warrant a byline, and the editorial notes that should have accompanied even minor pieces were absent, as if the article had appeared in the system without going through the normal process of assignment and editing and approval. Eleanor expanded her search. She looked for the phrase, "present until he wasn't," in other contexts, hoping to find that it was a regional expression, a colloquialism, something that people in Sacramento said, and that had simply seemed unusual to her Chicago-trained ear. She found it 7 more times. Not in Sacramento. In 7 different cities. In 7 different newspapers. In articles about 7 different people who had disappeared under circumstances that matched the pattern she was tracking. Each time, the phrase was attributed to an unnamed colleague. Each time, the article was written by a staff reporter. Each time, the editorial records were absent. Present until he wasn't. Present until she wasn't. Present until they weren't. The phrase appeared like a signature, a consistent element in articles that should have had nothing in common, a verbal fingerprint left by whoever or whatever was writing them. Eleanor began to suspect that the articles were not being written by reporters at all, that they were appearing in newspapers through some mechanism she didn't understand, that the pattern she was seeing was not the result of human error or coincidence, but of something deliberate, something systematic, something that was using the infrastructure of journalism to document events that no one else was documenting. She kept this suspicion to herself. She continued her research. She tried not to think about what it meant that the articles existed, what it implied about the reality she had spent her career believing in, what it suggested about the people whose disappearances had been recorded in 63 words and then forgotten. She failed. The thoughts came anyway. And with the thoughts came the understanding that she had stumbled onto something that she was not supposed to find, something that had been hiding in plain sight for years, something that was still happening, something that was waiting to be noticed by someone exactly like her. The core. Section 3. The pattern. The pattern expanded faster than Eleanor could track it. Once she knew what to look for, the word count, the date format, the phrase, the absent editorial records, she began finding examples everywhere, not just in healthcare, but in every industry, not just in American newspapers, but in publications from Europe and Asia and South America, not just in recent years, but going back decades. The earliest example she found was from 1987, a brief in the Manchester Evening News describing the disappearance of a factory worker named Thomas Whitfield, who had left his shift on August 12th and had never been seen again. 63 words. Present until he wasn't. Staff reporter. No editorial records. The pattern was older than she was. It had been running for at least 35 years, documenting disappearances that no one had connected, leaving a trail of identical articles in newspapers around the world, hiding in the spaces that no one paid attention to because the spaces were too mundane to warrant attention. Eleanor began mapping the cases. She created a database. She recorded names, dates, locations, occupations, every variable she could extract from the 63-word articles that had accumulated in archives and microfilm collections and digital databases, waiting for someone to notice that they were not isolated incidents, but entries in a much larger record. The map revealed patterns within patterns. The disappearances clustered around certain dates, not just the 12th of each month, but specifically the 12th of March, July, November, and February, with occasional outliers in April and October. The occupations clustered around certain industries: healthcare, education, transportation, and public safety, with a smaller number from manufacturing and hospitality. The locations clustered around certain geographies: cities with populations between 100,000 and 500,000, places large enough to have local newspapers, but small enough that a single disappearance wouldn't generate national attention. And the articles themselves clustered around certain publications, not the major papers, not the prestigious outlets, but the small circulation dailies and weeklies that existed on the margins of journalism, the papers that printed local news, because someone had to print local news, even though no one was reading it. The pattern was designed to be invisible, designed to scatter across time and space and medium in ways that would prevent any single observer from seeing the whole picture. Designed to hide in the infrastructure of documentation itself, using the very systems that humans had built to record reality as camouflage for something that didn't belong in reality at all. Eleanor spent 3 months building her database. She documented 217 cases, 217 people who had been present until they weren't, 217 articles, each exactly 63 words, each attributed to a staff reporter, each lacking the editorial records that should have accompanied even the most minor piece. She began reaching out to the families of the disappeared. Most didn't respond. Some had moved, left no forwarding address, become unreachable through any channel she could access. A few responded with confusion. They had never filed a missing persons report, they said. Their family member had simply left one day and never come back, and they had assumed it was a choice rather than a disappearance. One responded with fear. A woman named Patricia Herrera, the sister of David Herrera, the maintenance supervisor from Meridian County Hospital whose article had started Eleanor's investigation. Patricia agreed to speak on the condition that Eleanor never publish her name. "Something is wrong with his file," Patricia said during their phone conversation. "I've tried to get information from the police, from the hospital, from anyone who might know what happened. But every time I ask, the file changes." "Changes how?" "Details disappear," Patricia said. "The first time I requested the missing persons report, it said David was last seen in the parking lot. The second time, a year later, it said he was last seen in the break room. The third time, it said he was last seen in the basement." "Do you have copies?" "I tried to keep copies," Patricia said. "But the copies changed too. I printed the first report and put it in a folder. When I looked at it 6 months later, the words were different. The paper was the same. The printing was the same. But the words said something they hadn't said before." Eleanor felt the cold sensation in her chest intensify. "What did they say?" Patricia was quiet for a long moment. "The most recent version says he was last seen in the space between." "Between what?" "It doesn't say," Patricia said. "Just in the space between. And at the bottom, there's a sentence that wasn't in the original report. It says, 'This record has been finalized.'" Eleanor asked if she could see the document. Patricia agreed to send it. The document never arrived. When Eleanor followed up a week later, Patricia's phone number was disconnected. When she searched for Patricia Herrera in public records, she found no results. When she checked her own notes from the conversation, notes she had typed while they spoke, notes she had saved to her computer and backed up to the cloud, she found that the file existed but contained only a single line. "This record has been finalized." Section 4. The Silence. Eleanor went to her editor. She explained what she had found. The pattern, the word counts, the phrase, the missing editorial records, the documents that changed, the sources that disappeared. Her editor listened without interrupting. When Eleanor finished, her editor was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You need to stop." Eleanor frowned. "Stop what?" "Stop researching this. Stop building the database. Stop contacting families. Stop all of it." "But this is a story. This is the biggest story I've ever." "This is not a story," her editor said. "This is a pattern, and patterns like this don't get published." "Why not?" Her editor's expression shifted, not to anger, not to dismissal, but to something that looked almost like fear. "Because I've seen this before," she said. "Not this specific pattern, but patterns like it. Connections that shouldn't exist, records that change, sources that vanish." "When? What happened?" Her editor shook her head. "I don't remember. That's the point. I know I worked on something similar 15 years ago. I know I had a file. I know I was close to publishing, but I don't remember the details. I don't remember the names. I don't remember what the pattern was or what it meant." "How is that possible?" "I don't know," her editor said. "But I remember the feeling of noticing something that was designed not to be noticed. The feeling of pulling at a thread that was connected to something vast. The feeling of being watched by something that didn't want to be seen." She leaned forward, and I remember what happened after. The forgetting. The gaps in my memory where the investigation used to be. The sense that something had been taken from me without my consent. Eleanor stared at her. "You're telling me to stop because you forgot something?" "I'm telling you to stop because forgetting might be the best-case scenario," her editor said. "The people in your database, the ones who were present until they weren't, they didn't forget. They were removed. And the more you investigate, the more attention you attract from whatever is doing the removing." "I can't just stop." "You can," her editor said. "You have to, because if you don't, you'll become one of them. Your name will appear in a 63-word article in some newspaper that no one reads. Your colleagues will describe you as present until you weren't, and no one will ever know what happened to you." Eleanor left the meeting shaken, but not convinced. She continued her research, but carefully, privately, without telling anyone what she was doing. She stopped using her work computer. She stopped accessing the Tribune's archives. She worked from home, on a laptop she had purchased with cash, connecting through VPN services that promised anonymity. She became paranoid in ways that felt ridiculous until she remembered that the documents changed, that the sources disappeared, that her own notes had been altered by something that could access her files without leaving any trace of intrusion. She was being watched. She didn't know by what, but she knew that the watching was real, that the pattern she had found was not supposed to be found, that she had crossed a threshold without realizing it, and was now operating in a space where the normal rules no longer applied. She tried to contact other journalists who had investigated similar patterns. She found 3. 2 didn't respond. The third, a man named Robert Finch, who had written for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune until his retirement in 2015, agreed to meet her at a coffee shop in St. Paul. He was 74 years old, thin, with the watchful eyes of someone who had spent his life observing things that other people missed. "You found the 63-word articles," he said, before Eleanor could introduce herself. She nodded. "And now you want to know what they mean." She nodded again. Robert Finch sighed. "I found them too," he said. 40 years ago. Different pattern. Mine was about car accidents, not disappearances, but the same structure, same word count, same missing records, same phrase that appeared in every article, like a signature." "What phrase?" "The event was inevitable," Robert said. "Every article about a car accident that matched my pattern included that phrase. The event was inevitable. As if someone was explaining why the accident had happened, even though no explanation was needed. Even though inevitable is not a word that journalists use when describing accidents." "Did you publish?" Robert shook his head. "I tried. My editor killed the story, said it was too speculative, which was a lie. I had more documentation than any story I'd ever written. But the real reason was that the documentation kept changing. Every time I submitted a new draft, the sources I had cited no longer said what I had quoted them as saying. The articles I had found were now slightly different than they had been before. The word counts were no longer 63, they were 62 or 64 or some other number that broke the pattern. The pattern changed to hide itself? The pattern changed to prevent publication, Robert said. That's when I understood what I was dealing with. Not a conspiracy, not a cover-up, something else, something that existed in the infrastructure of documentation itself, something that used newspapers and records and archives as its medium, something that could alter the historical record to prevent its own exposure. "What is it?" Robert was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I have a theory. After 40 years of thinking about this, I have one theory that makes sense of everything I observed." "Tell me." Robert leaned forward. "The articles are not reports," he said. "They're not documentation of events that happened. They're instructions. They're the mechanism by which events are made to happen." Eleanor frowned. "I don't understand." "The articles appear before the events," Robert said, "not after. The 63 words are published, and then the person disappears. The accident is described as inevitable, and then the accident occurs. The documentation is not a record of reality. It's a template that reality is forced to match." "That's impossible." "I know," Robert said, "but I saw it happen. I found an article about an accident that hadn't occurred yet. I tried to warn the person who was described in the article. I drove to his house, knocked on his door, told him that he needed to avoid driving on a specific road on a specific date." "What happened?" Robert's expression became something Eleanor couldn't read. "The article changed," he said. "The date moved forward. The location shifted to a different road. And the accident happened anyway. The same accident, the same cause of death, the same phrase about inevitability. But now it matched the new version of the article, the version that had appeared after I tried to intervene." "You're saying the future changed to maintain consistency with the documentation?" "I'm saying the documentation is primary," Robert said. "Reality is secondary. The words come first. The events follow. And anything that threatens the consistency between the words and the events is corrected, removed, altered, finalized." He stood. "That's my theory," he said. "I'm telling you because you're already too deep to stop, and you deserve to understand what you're dealing with, but I can't help you further. I've spent 40 years staying invisible, and I'm not going to become visible now." He walked toward the door. "Wait," Eleanor said. "How do I protect myself?" Robert paused. "You don't," he said. "You just hope you're not important enough to finalize." He left. Eleanor sat alone in the coffee shop, surrounded by the sounds of normal life, and understood for the first time that her investigation was not going to end with a published story. It was going to end with her name in a 63-word article, or with her learning to become invisible. She wasn't sure which outcome was worse. Section 5. The Witness. 3 weeks after her meeting with Robert Finch, Eleanor received an email from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line was blank. The body of the email contained only a date and a location: April 12th, Garrison Memorial Hospital, room 412. Eleanor stared at the message. April 12th was 5 days away. Garrison Memorial Hospital was in Cleveland, a city that appeared 3 times in her database of disappearances. Room 412. The numbers aligned with the pattern: the 12th, the 4. She should have deleted the email. Should have treated it as the obvious trap that it appeared to be, a lure designed to draw her into a situation that she couldn't control, to make her present in a location where she might stop being present at all. But Eleanor had spent 4 months following a thread that no one else could see, and the thread was leading somewhere, and she couldn't turn back now without knowing where it led. She booked a flight to Cleveland. She arrived on April 11th. She checked into a hotel near the hospital and spent the night lying awake, watching the ceiling, trying to convince herself that she was making a reasonable choice. She failed. The choice was not reasonable. She went anyway. On April 12th at 3:47 p.m., Eleanor walked into Garrison Memorial Hospital and took the elevator to the 4th floor. The hallway was quiet. The lights were fluorescent and harsh. The walls were the particular shade of institutional beige that existed only in hospitals and government buildings and other places where human beings were processed rather than accommodated. Room 412 was at the end of the hall. The door was closed. Eleanor hesitated outside it for a long moment, her hand raised to knock, her mind running through scenarios: who might be inside, what might happen when she entered, whether this was the last decision she would ever make. She knocked, a voice from inside. "Come in." A woman's voice. Calm, expected. Eleanor opened the door. The room was a standard hospital room. Single bed, medical equipment, window overlooking the parking lot, the same institutional beige on the walls. A woman sat in the visitor's chair beside the bed. She was middle-aged, with gray hair and a face that seemed familiar in a way Eleanor couldn't place. The bed was empty. "Sit down," the woman said, gesturing to the chair on the other side of the bed. Eleanor sat. "You found the pattern," the woman said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes." "And now you want to know what it means." "Yes," the woman nodded. "My name is Catherine Marsh," she said. "I've been where you are. 23 years ago, I was a researcher at the Library of Congress. I noticed that certain records in the archive were inconsistent, documents that changed between viewings, files that appeared and disappeared, a pattern of 63-word entries that appeared across different collections, all describing events that shouldn't have been connected." "What happened?" "I investigated," Catherine said, "like you're investigating. I built a database. I contacted families. I tried to understand what I was seeing, and eventually I saw too much." "What did you see?" Catherine was quiet for a moment. "I saw an article about my own disappearance," she said. 63 words, published in the Washington Post on a date that hadn't happened yet, describing how I would leave work on April 12th and never be seen again. Eleanor felt the cold sensation in her chest become something sharper. "But you're here." "I'm here," Catherine agreed, "because I did something that the system didn't expect, something that broke the pattern, temporarily." "What?" "I stopped being the person the article described," Catherine said. "The article said I would leave work, so I quit my job. The article said I would be last seen at the library, so I never went back. The article said I would be reported missing by my husband, so I left him." "You destroyed your life to escape the pattern?" "I destroyed the life the pattern expected me to have," Catherine said. And when the template no longer matched reality, the article couldn't finalize me. It had described a person who no longer existed, a researcher at the Library of Congress with a husband and a routine. That person was gone, and the article couldn't adapt fast enough to find me. So you've been hiding ever since? I've been living, Catherine said, carefully, invisibly, never staying in one place long enough to establish a pattern, never doing anything that would create documentation, never becoming predictable enough for a 63-word article to describe. Eleanor thought about her own life, her job at the Tribune, her apartment in Chicago, her routines and habits, and all the ways she had made herself legible to systems that tracked and documented and recorded. Why are you telling me this? Because you're close to being finalized, Catherine said. I've been watching you since you started your investigation, watching from a distance through methods that don't create records, and I've seen your name appear. Appear where? Catherine reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of newspaper. She handed it to Eleanor. Eleanor unfolded it. The article was from the Chicago Tribune, dated April 15th, 3 days from now. Research analyst fails to report to work. The article described a woman named Eleanor Vance, 38, who had not appeared at her office on April 14th and had not been seen since. Her personal belongings were found at her desk. Her car was in the parking garage. Police were asking anyone with information to contact the department's non-emergency line. 63 words. Present until she wasn't. Staff reporter. Eleanor stared at the article. Her hands were shaking. This is dated 3 days from now, she said. How do you have a newspaper from the future? I don't, Catherine said. I have a newspaper from now. This edition of the Tribune was published this morning. It's in the online archives right now if you want to check. The article exists. It's already part of the record. And unless you do something to break the pattern, the events it describes will happen on the date it specifies. That's not possible. It's not supposed to be possible, Catherine said. But the system doesn't operate according to what's supposed to be possible. It operates according to its own rules. And its rules say that documentation precedes reality, that the record is primary and the events are secondary. Eleanor looked up from the article. What do I do? Catherine leaned forward. You become someone else, she said. You leave your job, your apartment, your city. You abandon everything that makes you documentable. You stop being Eleanor Vance, research analyst at the Chicago Tribune, and you become someone that no 63-word article can describe. I can't just disappear. You're going to disappear either way, Catherine said. The question is whether you disappear on your terms or on theirs, whether you choose the life you escape into or whether the system chooses the absence you become. Eleanor stared at the article in her hands. Her name, her description, her future, already written, already published, already waiting to become true. Who wrote this? She asked. Who is doing this? What does the system want? Catherine shook her head. I don't know, she said. In 23 years of hiding, I've never understood what the system is or what it wants. I only know what it does. It documents. It finalizes. It removes people who notice things they're not supposed to notice and replaces them with 63-word articles that no one reads. But why? I don't think why is a relevant question, Catherine said. The system doesn't operate on human logic. It doesn't want things the way humans want things. It just processes. It records. It maintains consistency between the documentation and reality, and when reality threatens to become inconsistent, it corrects the inconsistency. By removing people. By finalizing them, Catherine said. That's the word I've come to use. The people aren't killed exactly. They're not destroyed. They're finalized, moved from the category of present to the category of documented. They become entries in a record rather than actors in reality. Eleanor felt sick. The people in my database, she said, the 217 people who disappeared, they're all finalized? They're all in the archive, Catherine said. Whatever the archive is, wherever the archive exists, they're no longer here in this version of reality. They're there, in the record, present until they weren't, and now they're part of the documentation instead of part of the world. Eleanor looked at the article in her hands. April 15th. 3 days. I have 3 days, she said. Less than that, Catherine said. The article gives a date, but the finalization can happen anytime before that date. The article is a deadline, not a schedule. You need to become undocumentable now, today, before the system realizes that you're trying to escape. Eleanor stood. She walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot, at the cars sitting in their designated spaces, at the people walking in and out of the hospital, at the ordinary world continuing its ordinary operations without any awareness that reality was secondary to documentation. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" she asked. "How do I know this isn't a trap? How do I know you're not part of the system, trying to finalize me by getting me to isolate myself?" Catherine smiled. It was a sad smile. "You don't," she said. "You can't know. That's part of what makes the system so effective. It creates a situation where trust becomes impossible, where every source of information is potentially compromised, where the only rational response is paranoia that makes you exactly the kind of isolated, documentable target that the system prefers. Then why should I listen to you?" "Because you've already seen enough to know that I'm telling you something true," Catherine said. "You've seen the articles. You've seen the changes. You've seen the sources disappear and the documents rewrite themselves. You know that the system exists, even if you don't understand what it is. And you know that the article in your hands describes a future that will happen unless you do something to prevent it." Eleanor looked at the article again. Eleanor Vance. Present until she wasn't. "I don't want to disappear," she said. "Then become someone who can't be documented," Catherine said. "Become unknown, become invisible, become the kind of person that no 63-word article can describe because there's nothing consistent enough about you to put into words." Eleanor folded the article and put it in her pocket. "How?" she asked. Catherine told her. Section Cis. The realization. Eleanor did not go back to Chicago. She did not return her apartment, her job, her life. She followed Catherine's instructions, a set of protocols designed to make her invisible, to break every pattern that made her documentable, to become someone that the system could not describe in 63 words because she was no longer consistent enough to describe it all. She changed her name. She changed her appearance. She moved to a city where no one knew her and took a job that required no background check, no documentation, no record of who she had been before. She paid in cash. She avoided cameras. She never stayed in the same place for more than 3 months. She became a ghost, not dead, but absent, existing in the spaces between the systems that tracked and documented and recorded. And she continued her research. Because even though she was hiding, even though she was invisible, even though she had escaped the article that had described her disappearance, she could not stop thinking about the pattern, about the 217 people in her database, about the 63-word articles that had finalized them, about the system that was still operating, still documenting, still removing people who noticed things they weren't supposed to notice. She researched from libraries that had public computers and no security cameras. She researched from coffee shops where no one asked for her name. She researched from public parks and community centers and anywhere else that allowed access to information without requiring identification. And slowly, over months and years, she began to understand what the system actually was. It was not a conspiracy. It was not a government program. It was not an artificial intelligence or an alien presence or any of the other explanations that might have made sense in the context of human understanding. It was something else, something that existed in the infrastructure of documentation itself, in the newspapers and archives and databases that humanity had built to record its own existence. It was a property of recorded information, a consequence of creating systems that were designed to preserve records indefinitely, to ensure that documentation survived, to maintain archives that would outlast the events they described. The system was what happened when documentation became more permanent than reality, when the records lasted longer than the people they described, when the archive became more real than the world it was supposed to represent. Eleanor understood this the way she understood physics or mathematics, not as a belief, but as a recognition of something that had always been true, something that had always operated according to its own rules. something that humanity had accidentally activated by building the very systems that made civilization possible. Writing was the trigger. The moment humanity began recording its own existence, it had created a parallel reality, a reality made of words, of documents, of records that persisted even when the things they described had changed or disappeared. And that parallel reality had become powerful, had become primary, had become the template that physical reality was forced to match. The 63-word articles were not reports. They were not even instructions. They were the interface between the two realities, the mechanism by which the documentary reality reached into physical reality and made corrections, adjustments, finalizations. The people who were present until they weren't had been transferred, moved from one reality to the other, made permanent in the archive while being removed from the world, and the process was accelerating. Eleanor could see it in the data she continued to collect, the pattern she continued to track. The number of 63-word articles was increasing. The interval between finalizations was decreasing. The system was processing more people, faster, with greater efficiency, as if it were optimizing towards some goal that Eleanor could not understand but could feel approaching. Something was happening. Something was about to happen. And the documentation was preparing for it, creating records of events that hadn't occurred yet, finalizing people who hadn't disappeared yet, building an archive of a future that was still waiting to become real. Eleanor didn't know what the future contained, but she knew that the system was documenting it, and she knew that when the documentation was complete, the events it described would become inevitable. Section 7. The Accounting Year. On March 12, 2024, 5 years after Eleanor had first read the article about David Herrera, she found the master file. She was in a public library in Omaha, using a computer that had no connection to her identity, searching through digital archives that she had learned to access without leaving traces. She was looking for new 63-word articles, a routine she had developed, a way of monitoring the system's activity without attracting its attention. But instead of individual articles, she found something else, a folder, hidden in a dark corner of a newspaper consortium's digital archive, containing what appeared to be a comprehensive index of every 63-word article ever published, every name, every date, every location, every finalization, 200,000 entries, more than Eleanor had ever imagined, more than her database had captured. 200,000 people who had been present until they weren't, documented in 63 words, removed from reality and transferred to the archive. Eleanor scrolled through the entries, her hands shaking, her mind trying to process the scale of what she was seeing. The earliest entry was from 1842, a notice in a London newspaper about a clerk who had disappeared from his office. The most recent entry was from 3 days ago, an article in a small-town paper in Oregon about a teacher who had failed to arrive at school. Between them, nearly 2 centuries of finalizations, hidden in plain sight, documented in newspapers that no one read, preserved in archives that no one searched. The system had been operating for almost 200 years, had been removing people since before anyone alive had been born, had been building an archive of the finalized while humanity went about its business, oblivious to the fact that some portion of its population was being quietly transferred from one reality to another. But the index contained more than names and dates. It contained categories. Each entry was tagged with a classification that Eleanor didn't understand, codes that seemed to describe not what had happened to the finalized, but what they had been before they were finalized. Category A, observers. Category B, analysts. Category C, connectors. Category D, witnesses. Category E, threats. Eleanor searched for her own name in the index. She found it. The entry was dated April 15, 2023, the date that the article Catherine had shown her had specified, but the entry was incomplete. Where other entries showed status finalized, her entry showed status pending. And where other entries showed a category classification, her entry showed something different. Category, unknown. Classification, pending. Subject, under observation. She was still being watched, even though she had escaped the original article, even though she had made herself invisible. The system had not forgotten her. It had simply filed her in a different category, a category for people who had evaded finalization but remained subjects of interest. She searched for other entries with the same status. She found 47. 47 people who were pending, who had escaped finalization but remained in the index, who were being observed, who existed in a category that the system had not yet decided how to process. 47 people like her. Survivors, escapees, people who had learned to become invisible. Eleanor began searching for information about them, names, locations, anything that might help her find them, connect with them, build a network of people who understood what she understood. But as she searched, she noticed something strange. The entries were changing. One by one, the 47 pending entries were shifting from pending to finalized. The status updates were happening in real time. Someone, something, was processing the pending entries, finalizing people who had escaped years ago, clearing out the category of survivors as if the system had decided that the time for observation was over. Eleanor watched the entries change. 47 became 46, then 45, then 44. She searched for information about the people being finalized. She found 63-word articles appearing in newspapers across the country, articles describing people who had disappeared, who were present until they weren't, who had been finalized while Eleanor watched their status change in real time. The system was hunting the survivors, was eliminating everyone who had escaped its original processing, was closing out the pending category as if preparing for something new, a new phase, a new operation, a new processing cycle that required all previous exceptions to be resolved. Eleanor watched the counter drop, 43, 42, 41, and then she understood. The system was not hunting the survivors at random. It was hunting them in order. The entries were being finalized according to some sequence that Eleanor couldn't identify, some pattern that determined which pending case would be processed next. She looked at her own entry. She was still pending. But the entries being processed were approaching her position in whatever sequence the system was following. She had hours, maybe days, before her own status changed from pending to finalized. She closed the browser. She left the library. She walked out into the March afternoon, the wind cold against her face, the city continuing its ordinary operations around her, the documentation already being prepared for her finalization. She had spent 5 years learning to be invisible. It hadn't been enough. The system had found her anyway, had filed her in its index, had been watching her the entire time, waiting for the moment when it would complete the processing it had started 5 years ago. She could run again, could try to find a new way to become undocumentable, could spend the rest of her life, however long that was, fleeing from an archive that had already recorded her eventual finalization. Or she could do something else. Something that Robert Finch and Catherine Marsh and all the other survivors had never attempted. She could try to understand the system from inside, could let herself be finalized, let herself be transferred to the archive, let herself become part of the documentation in order to understand what the documentation actually was. It was a terrible idea. It was probably suicide. But Eleanor had spent 5 years running, and running had only delayed the inevitable. Maybe entering the archive was a different kind of escape. Maybe the finalized were not destroyed but preserved. Maybe the system was not killing people but saving them, moving them from a reality that was temporary to an archive that was permanent. She didn't know. She couldn't know without seeing for herself. She walked back toward the library, toward the computer, toward the index that was still open, still tracking, still counting down toward her finalization. She was going to let it happen. She was going to find out what the archive actually was. And if she survived, if survival was even a concept that applied to whatever the finalized became, she was going to try to communicate what she learned, to leave a record, to add an entry to the documentation that would tell the next observer, the next analyst, the next person who noticed the pattern, what they were actually dealing with. It was the only thing left to do, the only action that made sense when all other actions had failed. She sat down at the computer. She opened the index. She watched her entry change from pending to processing, and then the screen went dark. Section 8, The aftermath. The article appeared in the Chicago Tribune on March 15, 2024. Former analyst reported missing. It described a woman named Eleanor Vance, who had resigned from the Tribune 5 years earlier and had not been seen since, whose last known address was an apartment in Chicago that had been vacant for years, whose personal belongings had been found in a public library in Omaha on March 12th. The article was 63 words. It described her as present until she wasn't. It was attributed to a staff reporter. It was published without editorial records, and in the margins of the article, invisible to anyone who didn't know how to look, encoded in the spacing between letters, in the pattern of punctuation, in the specific choices of words that made up the 63, there was a message. A final transmission from Eleanor Vance. A record of what she had seen when she entered the archive. The message said, "The archive is not storage. It is preparation. The finalized are not removed. They are preserved. For what comes after. The documentation is not history. It is infrastructure for a reality that has not yet been activated. This reality, the one you are reading from, is temporary. It is the draft. The archive is the final version, and when the final version is complete, the draft will be deleted." The message continued, "I do not know when this will happen. I do not know what triggers the transition. I only know that the system is building towards something, collecting people, documenting events, creating an archive that will replace the reality we know." If you are reading this, you have already been noticed. You are already in the index. Your finalization is already scheduled. The only question is whether you spend your remaining time running or understanding. I chose understanding. I hope it was the right choice. I hope you find this message. I hope it helps. The message ended there. The article was published. And then, like all 63-word articles, it was forgotten, filed in an archive, preserved in a database, waiting for the next person who would notice the pattern. The pattern continued. 63-word articles appeared in newspapers around the world. People disappeared. Investigators noticed. Investigators were finalized. The archive grew. The documentation accumulated. The system continued its work, quiet, patient, inevitable, building toward a completion that no one in the temporary reality could understand. Eleanor Vance was in the archive now. She was part of the documentation. She was preserved, waiting, along with 200,000 others, for whatever came next. And in the temporary reality that remained, the newspapers continued to publish. The records continued to accumulate. The 63-word articles continued to appear, each one a template that reality would be forced to match, each one a small piece of the final version that was slowly being assembled from the fragments of the draft. The system did not explain itself. The system did not justify itself. The system simply recorded, documented, finalized, and waited for the moment when the archive would become more real than the reality it described. That moment was coming. The documentation suggested it was coming soon. But no one in the temporary reality knew exactly when. They only knew that the articles continued to appear, that the pattern continued to operate, that the people who noticed were processed, and that somewhere in an archive that existed outside of normal time, the finalized were waiting, present, preserved, patient, for whatever came next. The final entry in Eleanor Vance's research file, recovered years later by an investigator who noticed the pattern and was subsequently finalized, contained a single observation that she had written before her own processing. The horror is not that we are being removed. The horror is that we are being kept, for a purpose we are not meant to understand, until the understanding becomes unnecessary, because the final version has been completed, and the draft, everything we know, everyone we love, every moment we remember, has been deleted. The observation was 63 words long. It was attributed to no author. It was published in no newspaper, but it was preserved in the archive along with everything else. Waiting, recording, documenting. The accounting was still ongoing. It had always been ongoing, and it would continue until the final version was ready, until the draft was deleted, until the archive became the only reality, and the 63-word articles became the only history that anyone would ever remember. Section 9. The Inheritance. 7 months after Eleanor Vance's finalization, a young man named Marcus Chen found her research file. He was not looking for it. He was not even aware that such a file could exist, that someone had spent years documenting a pattern that operated beneath the surface of ordinary reality, that the documentation had survived its creator's removal, that the archive had preserved not only the finalized, but also the evidence of their investigations. Marcus was a graduate student in library science at the University of Wisconsin, working on a thesis about the degradation of digital newspaper archives, the way that older articles sometimes disappeared from databases, the way that metadata was lost during format migrations, the way that the historical record was quietly eroding as the infrastructure that preserved it aged and failed. It was tedious work, the kind of work that required spending hours in basements and server rooms comparing physical copies of newspapers to their digital versions, documenting the discrepancies that accumulated over time. The kind of work that no one cared about except the handful of academics who understood that history was only as reliable as the systems that preserved it. Marcus had been comparing a 1987 edition of the Manchester Evening News to its digital archive when he noticed something strange. The physical copy contained an article that the digital version did not. This was not unusual. Articles were sometimes omitted from digital archives due to copyright issues, space constraints, or simple human error. But the article that was missing was not an ordinary article. It was 63 words long. It described a factory worker named Thomas Whitfield who had disappeared from his shift on August 12th and had never been seen again. It included the phrase, "present until he wasn't," and it was attributed to a staff reporter with no editorial records. Marcus stared at the article. He didn't know why it felt significant, didn't know why his hands had started trembling, didn't know why the cold sensation in his chest was intensifying with every word he read. But he knew, with a certainty that bypassed rational thought, that he had found something important, something that was not supposed to be found, something that the digital archive had deliberately excluded. He photographed the article with his phone. He searched for similar articles in other physical copies. He found 12 more over the next 3 weeks, all 63 words, all describing disappearances, all missing from the digital archives, all containing the same phrase and the same attribution. And then he found Eleanor's file. It was hidden in a box of uncatalogued materials in the basement of the Wisconsin Historical Society, a collection of papers that had been donated anonymously, that no one had examined, that had been sitting in storage for months waiting for someone to process them. The file contained everything: the database of 217 cases, the analysis of patterns within patterns, the notes from conversations with Robert Finch and Catherine Marsh, the article from the Chicago Tribune that had described Eleanor's own disappearance before it happened, and the final message, the 63-word transmission that Eleanor had encoded in the margins of her finalization article, explaining what she had learned about the archive and its purpose. Marcus read the file from beginning to end. It took him 4 hours. When he finished, he understood that his thesis about digital archive degradation was no longer relevant. He understood that the discrepancies he had been documenting were not accidents. They were corrections. The digital archives were being edited, not by human administrators, not by automated systems, but by something that existed within the infrastructure of documentation itself. Something that was removing evidence of its own operations. Something that was ensuring that the pattern remained invisible to anyone who relied on digital records. The physical copies still contained the truth, but physical copies were disappearing too, degrading, being recycled, being replaced by digital versions that had been quietly sanitized. In another generation, there would be no evidence left. The pattern would be invisible. The 63-word articles would exist only in the archive that had created them. And no one would ever know that 200,000 people had been finalized, removed from reality, and preserved in a documentation system that was building towards something no one in the temporary reality could understand. Marcus knew he had a choice. He could destroy Eleanor's file, could pretend he had never found it, could complete his thesis on archive degradation and graduate and get a job and live a normal life without ever thinking about 63-word articles or finalization or the archive that was waiting to replace reality. Or he could continue her work, could pick up where she had left off, could try to understand what she had understood and see what she had seen, and maybe, if he was careful, if he was lucky, if he was different from all the others who had noticed the pattern, find a way to stop what was happening. He thought about it for 3 days. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He just sat in his apartment, surrounded by Eleanor's research, trying to decide whether understanding was worth the cost of being understood. On the 4th day, he made his choice. He opened a new document on his computer. He began typing, and somewhere, in a system he didn't know existed, his name was added to the index. Have Section X, the acceleration. The pattern was accelerating. Marcus could see it in the data he was collecting, the articles he was finding, the frequency of finalizations that had increased dramatically in the months since Eleanor's processing. In 2019, there had been approximately 47 63-word articles published worldwide. In 2020, the number had risen to 63. In 2021, to 89. In 2022, to 127. In 2023, to 204. And in the first 3 months of 2024 alone, Marcus had found 163 articles, a rate that suggested the year would end with more finalizations than all previous years combined. The system was speeding up, processing more people, building the archive faster, as if some deadline were approaching, some threshold that required the documentation to be complete, some transition that demanded all pending cases be resolved. Marcus tried to understand what was driving the acceleration. He analyzed the data for patterns. He looked for correlations between finalization rates and external events, economic indicators, political developments, natural disasters, anything that might explain why the system was suddenly processing at such an increased pace. He found nothing. The acceleration was not responsive to external conditions. It was internal, driven by some logic that existed within the system itself, some schedule that had been programmed long before Marcus was born. The only pattern he could identify was temporal. The finalizations were clustering around specific dates, not just the 12th of each month, but increasingly the 12th of March, June, September, and December. The equinoxes and solstices, the turning points of the year. As if the system were synchronizing its operations with celestial rhythms, with the movements of the planet through space, with cycles that predated human civilization by billions of years. Marcus didn't know what this meant, but he knew it meant something. The system was not arbitrary, it was precise. It operated according to rules that had been established long ago and that were now approaching some kind of culmination. He began tracking the dates more carefully. He created a calendar that marked every finalization he could document, every 63-word article he could find, every instance of the pattern manifesting in newspapers around the world. The calendar revealed something terrifying. The finalizations were not just increasing in frequency, they were converging. The dates were getting closer together. The clusters were becoming denser. The pattern was contracting toward a single point, a moment when all the finalizations would occur simultaneously, when the archive would complete its collection, when the documentation would reach whatever threshold it had been building toward for nearly 2 centuries. Marcus calculated the convergence point, December 12th, 2024, 9 months away. The system would complete its work on December 12th, 2024. And whatever happened after that, whatever the final version was that Eleanor had described in her last message, would begin. Marcus stared at the date. He had 9 months. 9 months to understand what was happening. 9 months to find a way to stop it. 9 months before the draft was deleted and the archive became the only reality. He didn't know if it was enough time. He didn't know if any amount of time would be enough. But he knew he had to try. Section 1. The network. Marcus was not alone. He discovered this on a Tuesday afternoon in April when he received an email from an address he didn't recognize. The subject line said, "You are not the first." The body of the email contained a link to an encrypted chat room and a message. "There are others who have seen what you are seeing. Join us. But be careful. The system monitors all communication. Use only the methods we provide. Trust no one who contacts you through normal channels." Marcus hesitated. The email could be a trap, a way for the system to identify and process everyone who had noticed the pattern. A lure designed to draw survivors into a single location where they could be finalized efficiently. But the email could also be genuine. A network of people who had escaped finalization. A community of observers who had learned to hide from the system while continuing to study it. A resource that might help him understand what was happening and how to stop it. He joined the chat room. There were 43 people in the network. They came from 12 countries. They had been studying the pattern for periods ranging from 6 months to 37 years. And they had developed protocols, methods of communication that avoided documentation, techniques for researching the system without attracting its attention, strategies for remaining invisible while continuing to observe. The network had a name. They called themselves the Unwritten, because the only way to survive was to avoid being written, to exist outside of documentation, to leave no records, to become impossible to describe in 63 words. The Unwritten shared what they knew. They had confirmed Eleanor's discovery that the system was building toward a completion event. They had identified December 12, 2024 as the convergence point. They had calculated that approximately 2.3 million people would be finalized before the completion event, enough to populate the archive with whatever the system needed to activate the final version. But they had also discovered something that Eleanor had not known, something that changed everything Marcus thought he understood about the pattern. The 63-word articles were not the only documentation. They were just the visible portion, the interface between the archive and the temporary reality. Beneath them, hidden in the infrastructure of every newspaper and database and record-keeping system in the world, there was a deeper layer of documentation. A layer that recorded not just the finalized, but everyone. Every person who had ever existed. Every life that had ever been lived. Every moment that had ever occurred. The system was not just collecting people who noticed the pattern, it was documenting all of humanity. Building a complete record of the temporary reality. Preserving everything that existed in the draft so that it could be transferred to the final version. The 63-word articles were not removals. They were priorities. They identified people who needed to be processed first, observers, analysts, threats, people whose awareness of the system made them important to finalize before the completion event. But everyone else was being documented too, quietly, invisibly, without 63-word articles to mark their processing. The completion event on December 12th would not just affect the people in the archive, it would affect everyone. The entire temporary reality would be transferred. The draft would become the final version, and everyone who existed in the draft would become part of the documentation, forever. Hasher Section Thweth, the final record. Marcus spent the remaining months working with the Unwritten. They tried everything they could think of to stop the completion event. They attempted to corrupt the system's documentation by introducing errors into newspaper archives. The errors were corrected within hours. They tried to warn people about what was happening by publishing articles that explained the pattern. The articles disappeared before they could be read. They tried to physically destroy servers and archives that they believed contained portions of the system. The servers were rebuilt, the archives were restored, and the people who had destroyed them were finalized. Nothing worked. The system was too distributed, too resilient, too deeply embedded in the infrastructure of documentation itself. It couldn't be stopped. It couldn't be corrupted. It couldn't be destroyed. It could only be observed. And so, in the final days before December 12th, the Unwritten made a decision. They would document everything they had learned. They would create a record of their observations, their theories, their attempts to understand and stop the system. They would encode this record in a format that might survive the completion event, hidden in the margins of the documentation, embedded in the patterns of the archive itself. And they would hope that someone, something, in the final version would find it, would read it, would understand what had happened to the temporary reality and the people who had lived in it. Marcus wrote the final entry in the record. He wrote it on December 11th, 2024, sitting alone in a room that had no windows. using a computer that had no connection to any network, typing words that might be the last words anyone in the temporary reality would ever produce. He wrote, "We do not know what the final version will be. We do not know if anyone will survive the transition. We do not know if survival is even a concept that applies to what is about to happen. But we know that we existed. We know that we loved and feared and hoped and failed. We know that we tried to understand something that was not meant to be understood. And we know that our trying mattered, not because it changed anything, but because it proved that we were more than documentation. We were people. We were real. And whatever comes next, whatever the final version contains, whatever the archive becomes when the draft is deleted, we were here. We existed. We mattered, even if no record of our mattering survives." He saved the file. He encoded it in the margins of the documentation, using methods the unwritten had developed. He hoped it would be found. He knew it probably wouldn't. And then he waited. For midnight. For December 12th. For the completion event that would end the temporary reality and activate whatever came next. He didn't know what he would feel when it happened. He didn't know if he would feel anything at all. But he knew that he had done everything he could. And sometimes that was enough. Sometimes that was all anyone could do. Epilogue: The Archive. The completion event occurred at 12 a.m. on December 12th, 2024. It was not dramatic. There were no explosions, no cataclysms, no visible signs that anything had changed. The world continued as it had always continued, people waking up, going to work, living their lives, unaware that anything significant had occurred. But something had changed. The temporary reality had been transferred. The draft had become the final version, and everyone who had existed in the draft was now part of the documentation. Preserved, permanent, forever. The difference was subtle but absolute. The future was no longer uncertain. The documentation had been completed, and every moment that would ever occur had already been recorded in an archive that existed outside of time. The people living in the final version did not know this. They experienced their lives as if they were still making choices, still shaping their futures, still existing in a reality where the next moment was undetermined. But the documentation knew otherwise. The archive contained everything, every life, every death, every moment of joy and sorrow and boredom and transcendence. All of it recorded, all of it preserved, all of it finalized. And somewhere in the margins of the documentation, hidden in the patterns of the archive, encoded in the spaces between words, there was a message, a record of the people who had noticed, who had tried to understand, who had failed to stop what was happening, but had succeeded in documenting their failure. The message waited, patient, permanent, for someone in the final version to find it, to read it, to understand that the reality they were living in was not what they thought it was, that they were not making choices, they were following a script that had already been written, that they were not living, they were being read. The message waited, it would wait forever. Because in the archive, forever was the only duration that existed. And the documentation never ended. It only recorded, preserved, finalized, forever. This story was reported as fiction. It wasn't. Check the date. Check the word count. Check the margins. The documentation is still ongoing, and you are already in the archive.